Welcome to our event, Think Better with Katy Milkman. I am George Wu. I'm a professor of behavioral science at Chicago Booth and a member of our Center for Decision Research. This is the third of our Think Better series, third year. For tonight's event, I think we have over 2,000 registrations, so that's a remarkable number. Look for announcements about next year's speakers soon. Let me turn to tonight's event. We are pleased to have with us Katy Milkman. Katy is the James G. Dinnen Professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. She has a brand new book called How to Change the Science of Getting from Where You Are to Where You Want to Be, which was just published by Penguin and is available everywhere books are sold. Please get a copy. It's terrific. I've read it and really enjoyed it. After tonight, my guess is that many of you will be buying copies for your friends and family. A couple of things about Katy. Katy is a pioneer in applying ideas of behavioral science to improve outcomes for individuals as well as organizations. She is also the host of Charles Schwab's popular behavioral economics podcast, Choiceology, and a former president of the Society for Judgment and Decision Making. So it is so good to see you, Katy. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm sorry that we can't be here in person, but I can't think of a much better way of spending the next hour than talking to a great friend and, talking about behavioral science and how we can use it to get better outcomes for ourselves and others.
I feel the same way. I'm really glad to be here.
So let me just say a couple things. I'm going to be having a conversation with Katy, and thanks to the registrants who have sent along questions ahead of time, I've tried to incorporate these questions when I can. Let me just start with by talking about the title of your book. It's called How to Change the Science of Getting from Where You Are to Where You Want to Be. I had full well intended to bring a copy, but I forgot. And Katy has a chapter.
I have a chapter on that, but I have one, so I can save you.
And you have a chapter on forgetfulness, so I think that's actually probably relevant for me. But I'd love if you could share with the audience a little bit about how we think about the science, or how you think about the science of why change is hard. If you're taking, say, a classical economics view, you just say, if the benefit of change is higher than the cost of change, you do it. Apparently, people find change harder than that. So I'd love if you could share a little bit about why.
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think, and there are more reasons that I cover in the book. I think one of the most important reasons probably relates to prospect theory and the amazing work by Kahneman and Tversky, which shows that we are generally loss averse, and any deviation from our current status quo, any change, feels like a loss relative to what we have now in life. And so because we dislike losses, they loom, some people would estimate roughly twice as large as gains, although I know that exact number is debated. It's certainly larger than gains. That's probably one of the big reasons that we're so inertial. But there are other forces too, so many of them. And that's really what the book is organized and structured around, all of the things that make change hard. One of them that I think is particularly pernicious and that I started my career studying, I think we may talk a little bit about one of the first papers I ever wrote, is present bias, which is our tendency to overweight whatever instantly gratifying thing is sitting in front of us, the hamburger, the opportunity to binge watch Netflix, whatever temptation awaits you, being able to scroll through Twitter instead of pay attention to your family. It feels instantly gratifying. It's not the right thing to do. In the long run, you'll get more gain, more benefit from taking a different path. But we are creatures of the moment. And so that's another thing that I think makes change hard, because so many changes require delaying gratification, and we're not wired to do that well. So I would say those are two of the big ones, but there are many others, including forgetfulness, as you alluded to, including habits. I'm
looking for tips. So let's turn to that DVD paper, which is a really interesting paper, because I think it really illustrates the conflict. One of the first of your now many papers. Can you talk a little bit about what that paper illustrates in some sense about the conflicts that we have as human beings trying to change and get better?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. Although I have to say, every time I explain this paper, it makes me feel like a dinosaur. It's like going to a class where your professor explains to you that they used to use, have one of those big computers and they'd like use a punch card to run the numbers. And right. So I sort of feel that way when I explain this project. So back when I was a grad student, I'm so old that the way that you rented movies, there was no streaming. You rented them on these things called DVDs that some of you may have heard of and even experienced. And Netflix was this hot new company that would send them to you in the mail. And I was interested, and so were my collaborators, Max Bazerman and Todd Rogers, in whether or not it might be the case that in this newfangled world where you're getting your DVDs by mail and you're picking them in advance of actually making the decision to pop it in the DVD player and watch it, you might see that there's some funky things happening. So if people flip their preferences in consistent ways when they're making choices about the future versus the present, then we had some interesting predictions to make about DVD rentals. And specifically, we thought when somebody rents a really highbrow DVD, the kind of DVD that might be sort of goal relevant, like a educational documentary, say, this is the kind of person I want to be. I should be watching these movies. They'll enlighten me. They're going to want to do that 2 days in advance. But when it comes to the heat of the moment and they're deciding what to pop in the DVD player, they're probably going to go for, Godzilla or something else with special effects. It's not very enriching. And so we thought there'd be this preference reversal, and we decided to test it. We got data from actually the Australian knockoff of Netflix, QuickFlix, and we analyzed it and showed people hold certain, highbrow DVDs much longer. Once they've rented them, they like sit around. Yeah, I'll watch it tomorrow. And they're also more likely to return DVDs they rent out of their rental order when one is when they rent a highbrow movie before a lowbrow movie. They actually switch. Oh, well, yeah, I said I wanted that one first, but actually I'm going to pop this one. And so that was just a nice way to test an implication of present bias for consumer preferences. And it was part of my dissertation, and you were my amazing editor when I published.
I was hoping you didn't say that, but thank you, Katy. And I think it illustrates in some ways, I think one of the really kind of profound reasons why change is hard. Change is always attractive. We're talking about starting a few days from now or a week from now, but change is hard when we're in the moment and thinking about it. So I want to talk, your book, amazing book, and you start with something that both of us love, which is tennis. You talk about a story about Brad Gilbert, who becomes the coach for the very famous tennis player, Andre Agassi, and you use the story to illustrate a little bit about the process that individuals should go through when they're thinking about change. So I'd love if you shared that story, but also talked about the template that you used throughout the book.
Yeah, I would love that. And I realize we have a large audience, so it's a little weird to disclose exciting details, but they're just sitting in on our conversation is how I think about it. Hopefully they'll enjoy this too. The most exciting news, my editor emailed me yesterday and said, Andre Agassi's got accepted a copy of the book and we'll be taking a look. So that is the most exciting reader I've heard about. I'm very excited about that. One of my childhood heroes, and as George mentioned, both of us love the sport of tennis, and I played a lot. So this was a story. And by the way, if you ever write a book, a thing that really was strange to me is that I thought I would write a book in the order in which you will read the book, but I actually wrote the introduction last. I had a really crummy introduction that I wrote initially, and then I, ripped it up. And the last thing I did was insert this introduction. And the story that I open with it's my favorite story in the whole book. It's about a career change that, it reshaped Andre Agassi's career and life. So probably you've heard of him, but he was this flashy player and he had all these endorsements. Canon gave him the tagline, "Image is everything," in this campaign he did with them. He wore long hair and ripped jeans, and he even wore lipstick to a tournament. So everyone knew who Andre Agassi was in the 90s, but he wasn't famous for his achievements. He was really famous for flash. And that was disappointing to a lot of people, including Andre Agassi himself. As a junior player, everyone said he's going to be number one in the world. He has more talent in his little finger than most of us have, in our whole bodies. He was just exceptional. And he grew up playing against people like Pete Sampras, Jim Courier, Michael Chang. But in the early 90s, they were all ranked ahead of him. And he was not performing very well. In fact, at the moment that the story picks up, his ranking has plummeted. He's about 30th in the world. His coach of a decade has just unceremoniously dropped him. He found out from reading a headline in the newspaper. And, he's trying to figure out how to pull himself together. And he ends up having dinner at the prompting of his manager and friend with Brad Gilbert, who just written a best-selling book called Winning Ugly. And the dinner is really important because Brad Gilbert sits down and basically analyzes what's wrong with Agassi's game. And what he says is, look, you are a great player, but you're playing all wrong. You're incredibly talented. You can hit winners on every shot and that you can beat many people that way. And so you play a self-focused game, a self-centered game. You're not figuring out who's your opponent, what are you up against, what are their weaknesses. You're playing to beat them. You're not playing to let them lose. And as a result, you're taking too much risk. And you're not performing nearly as well as you could. And this is sort of the premise of Gilbert's book. He was a player too. He'd gotten to number 4 in the world with far less talent. He was never a great player, but he wrote this best-selling book that was really all about the strategy of tennis and the inner game and how you can outsmart your opponent, and that's how you can win. So he told Agassi, you've got to change your style. You have to get out on the court, understand what you're up against, figure out what your opponent's weaknesses are, take advantage, and that's how you can become number 1 in the world. And Agassi hired him. He went into the US Open later that year, unseeded because he'd had such a rough run. And he won the whole tournament, which was actually a historic event. No one had won who was unseeded in decades. And he went on to be number 1 in the world for something like 101 weeks in the course of his whole career. There were ups and downs, but it was a clear turning point when he learned to think differently about how to win and how to play the sport. And I use this story as a metaphor because I actually feel like the biggest insight about behavior change from my whole career working with companies and talking to individuals and introspecting, which we all do in our research when it's on behavioral science, is that too often we aren't strategic. We don't actually take the time to figure out what is the specific obstacle that we're facing and then develop a strategy that's tailored to suit that obstacle. We play this sort of one-size-fits-all strategy. And just as in tennis, you can hit the ball across court a lot and that'll go decently or work someone's backhand, but you do better when you understand your opponent and you tailor the strategy. So that's sort of it's the center of the book. I open the book with that story and then pivot, to use another sports term, to talking about what are those barriers, what are the best strategies science has to offer.
So let's talk about the recipe. And I love the sort of articulation that sort of understanding the adversary and then using science in some ways to overcome that. And I think that all of us who teach behavioral science at Booth and lots of other places emphasize to our students that it's really important to understand the science and the psychology of the things that are holding us back. And I'd love if you got into that a little bit more detail. Why is it so important to really understand fundamentally what it is that's keeping us from being successful at change?
Yeah, well, I think the challenge is if we don't know what's holding us back, we'll apply the wrong solution, even if we think we're using science or a solution that's not suited to the adversary. So, for example, imagine that you're thinking about trying to intervene with someone in your life, or you're a doctor and you're trying to intervene with a patient who should be taking life-saving medications. And for instance, it turns out there are all these really interesting problems. This is one of them. After patients have a heart attack, about 40% of them are still taking the medications they need to prevent a next heart attack 6 months later. Mm-hmm. And life and death, right? And the compliance is terrible. So imagine you're faced with this problem, either a single individual or many of them. But imagine the single individual. It's going to be really important if you want to solve the problem to understand the source. So if the reason they're not taking their medications is they just can't remember, they just forget every night, and that is why they're not doing it, you have a really different problem and you need to structure a really different solution than if the reason is they have side effects that are making me uncomfortable. And so even though I know it's good for me in the long run, these side effects of discomfort, because I'm present biased, I'm overweighting those. And we need to find some way to dampen the side effects, make it less unpleasant, I should say, to experience them, or give you an incentive that's instantly gratifying so that you'll be able to overcome that. So which barrier you face is going to tell you what kinds of solutions are likely to be effective.
Let's jump in and talk a little bit about the psychology of some of them. It's not as if I fall prey to any of these things, except for all of them. Impulsivity, procrastination. I already told you that I was forgetful. Any of those you want to kind of unpack a little bit and talk about why they're in everybody's way or most of our ways in terms of getting us to make change in our lives?
Yeah, well, we talked a little bit about present bias, but I know that you've had Ayelet Fishbach on as a speaker in one of these events, and I actually just want to mention one of my favorite studies by her that she may have talked about, but you can't hear about it enough because it's so important. She's done this incredible work, professor at Booth, along with her former student, Caitlin Woolley, who's at Cornell University. And they've found that one of the key solutions to present bias, which is this big pernicious barrier of, I overweight the instant experience and underweight the long-term benefit of the thing I should be doing, is that we can actually make it more enjoyable in the moment to do the thing that's good for us. So specifically, most people, if they have some new goal, right? I want to start working out regularly, or I want to start studying harder for class. Most people, the approach they take is they think, like, what's the most effective strategy I can use? Like, if I want to build a workout routine, I'm going to get on the maximally punishing Stairmaster and I'm going to burn as many calories as I can. It's going to be super great. Or, I'm going to go study in a windowless room with no distractions and I'm going to get all my work done. And that's going to be how I spend every afternoon from now on. So most people take that effectiveness approach. A small subset of people, it seems, naturally have a different instinct, which is to try to do this in the most fun way possible. Like, I will go to Zumba class with my friends at the gym and love it. Or I will study in a coffee shop and take the occasional break after I've done a Pomodoro in order to reward myself with a cookie that I like. Some people find ways to make it fun or pursue change in ways that are fun. And what Ayelet and Caitlin have shown is that those people persist longer, and not just those types of people. They've done random assignment studies where they tell people pursue change or pursue this goal in a way that will be more enjoyable. And just that instruction leads people to do it differently and persist longer. So I think that's a really important insight, rather than sort of just trying to barrel through when it comes to present bias. A key effective strategy is to recognize, okay, this is my barrier. It has to be fun in the moment, or it has to be enjoyable in the moment. There have to be rewards in the moment, or I'm not going to do it. And then design your approach to accommodate it, meaning make it fun in the moment. And I studied one way to do that myself, which is temptation bundling. So literally linking something you enjoy in the moment with the thing that's a bit of a chore. So I only let myself listen to tempting audio novels while I'm exercising. And then I look forward to my workouts because I get to hear what happens next to my favorite characters. Time flies while I'm at the gym, and I don't waste time on entertainment at home when I should be focused on other things.
And I think you call this is like the Mary Poppins strategy or something like that. What do you, spoonful of sugar?
Spoonful of sugar, exactly. I think what Ayelet and Caitlin have written about really, I think Mary Poppins gets it for kids, right? The spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. That's basically, it's just that we normally think that, that's like a tactic you use to get 5-year-olds or 7-year-olds, but to do something. But it turns out we're all kind of wired the same way. Kids have a little bit less self-control than adults, but we give ourselves too much credit for being able to just push through. And the truth is we're like kids. We're not very good at getting things done or persisting on things if they aren't pleasant in the moment.
So let's talk about procrastination. And I think it's something that maybe even maybe even if you face, Katy, but I'm not completely sure. I'm going to actually ask you a little bit about some strategies that you found successful in writing your book. But talk a little bit about the psychology of procrastination and how we might go about overcoming that.
Yeah, well, it's very related to present bias. I actually, present bias causes us to delay doing many of the things that are good for us in the long run. We put off writing the term paper in favor of watching the TV show or hanging out with our friends. We put off, doing the laundry or cleaning the house, and it becomes disgusting. I'm actually thinking about my freshman year dorm and how many times I put off, and we all put off cleaning that shower. Oh, anyway, it can have bad outcomes. So procrastination it's the result of lots of present bias accumulating. And there's, you can try to make things fun, and that would probably help a bit with procrastination too. That's sort of the carrot approach. In the book, I talk about the stick approach as well, which I actually haven't studied. I've written about a little bit in academic pieces, but I find so interesting, fascinating, really, how few people adopt it and how effective it is when adopted. So the stick approach is to treat yourself, your future self, the way you're used to being treated by your teachers, your managers, your government, which is to say, people who are looking out for us often create rules. They set deadlines, they create penalties. Sometimes they even send us to jail if we do things that are not in our and society's long-term best interest, right? Speeding, littering, not turning your taxes in on time. There are consequences for those behaviors that are impulsive, that are imposed on us by others. And the idea of the stick as a self-help tool is that you can actually create those kinds of boundaries for yourself and those kinds of penalties for yourself. And there's really fascinating research showing how incredibly effective this is. So one of my favorite studies was by Nava Ashraf, Dean Carlin, and Wesley Yin, and looked specifically at the challenge of savings, and that lots of savings accounts don't accumulate large balances, in part because we're tempted to dip in and grab the money out. We don't let it accumulate. Every time there's a festival, a birthday party, something, we go in and grab it. So they realized that one strategy that might be useful would be to actually just give people an account where they couldn't take their money out until they reached a certain predetermined savings date or predetermined savings goal. So if you're procrastinating on building that nest egg, you won't be able to procrastinate any longer, because once you put the money in, it can't come out. So the first question is, will anyone put money into an account like this? Because it sounds nuts. And if you talk to a classical economist, they're like, excuse me, wait, you're not giving people a better interest rate and you want them to put their money where? Into an account that's not liquid? Why would they do that? So it's very confusing. And in fact, lots of people don't. But in a randomized controlled trial that Ashraf, Carlin, and Yin ran, about 30% of people offered this account alongside a standard savings account where you could take your money in and out anytime you want. It has the same interest rate. About 30% of people actually said, I do want that commitment account where I can't get my money out. That sounds great. It's kind of like a piggy bank, but like a really seriously locked piggy bank. What's really fascinating is in this randomized controlled trial that they ran, not only did 30% want the account, but when they compared roughly, I'll say 1,000 people who were offered an account to 1,000 people who weren't, they saw 80% higher savings total among the group that was offered the account than the group that wasn't, even though only 30% even took it up. So really effective tools. And that's just one example. There's other research showing cash commitments where you put money on the line that you'll forfeit if you fail to achieve a goal can be really valuable too. There's a study where giving people access to these kinds of accounts that they'd forfeit if they didn't quit smoking in 6 months, improved quit rates by 30%. So again, low take-up is sort of the case because people find this weird. But if we could get more people to try these tools, they're remarkably effective at changing behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really interesting things is that in some ways, restricting people's behavior, their freedom, taking options away is actually something better. And one thing I was having a conversation with some of my students who are graduating, and obviously the MBA curriculum or any kind of thing is a really structured program. They're going to be out in the world, hopefully trying to continue to learn. A lot of the people out here are alums who are on the other side of the MBA program. And I think that everyone knows that, they want to try to, continue to read and do Coursera and stuff like that, but they don't stick with it. And, think about just like I said, interesting. Obviously, we have a very learned crowd here, but how might you suggest to somebody that they are more successful at work? I mean, short of going back and re-enrolling in the MBA program, which is a big commitment, but a smaller commitment that people can, ordinary people can do without huge dedications of time.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we know is that when you break down a big commitment into a smaller, more bite-sized chunk, that also makes it more approachable. So you can use these commitment devices and put money on the line that you'll forfeit if you don't spend the time doing those things that you just have defined. But I also want to mention that breaking down the goal so that the commitment is more of a weekly commitment for something like that, rather than in the next year, I hope to do X, is likely to be more effective. There's this great paper by Hal Hirschfield and colleagues showing that if you, for instance, it's in the domain of savings, but if you offer people the chance to save $5 a day as opposed to, $150 a month, which is roughly the same decision, it's dramatically more attractive in that bite-sized component. And one of my doctoral students, Anish Rai, has led a project with a similar flavor, but it's about repeated engagement in something, volunteering group. People had committed 200 hours to volunteering over the course of the next year. And we either reminded them to do that a little bit each week, and we reminded them every other week, or we said, try to do 4 hours each week to meet that 200 hour a year goal. Or we said, try to do 8 hours every 2 weeks. Either of those broken down goals led to about 10% more progress because people felt like it was doable. So I think for this exact goal you're talking about, you could use a commitment device. You could put money on the line that you'll forfeit if you don't achieve those goals. But it would probably be best if the commitment was to bite-sized components that are made on more of a weekly basis than a longer-term basis. And the stakes also don't have to be monetary. Sometimes we're not comfortable with that. Sometimes the stakes can be reputational. You tell someone you care about. There's a doctor's office study where you sign your name to a pledge and stick it on the wall so your patients can see it and it changes behavior. So there's other ways we can do it as well.
One way that you didn't talk about are habits, and some people are super successful at they wake up on Saturday morning, they get out their books, and that's the time, and they're going to work from 8 o'clock till noon, working through whatever that is and bettering themselves. And I think all of us can see why having a habit of waking up on Saturday morning and working through that and doing that religiously works. Most of us don't have those habits, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what you learn. A lot about habits. You've studied them a lot. You also know both why they work and also why they fail. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the basic sort of model of habit, I think, has been popularized by some great books that I highly recommend, including The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, Atomic Habit. Wendy Wood, who's USC professor and probably the world's expert on habit, has a great book called Good Habits, Bad Habits. And the basic model that all of them describe very nicely is this sort of loop that's been studied really well in animals and decently in humans, where if there's some sort of cue that triggers a response, like, in the morning I wake up, so my cue is like, oh, I open my eyes, I'm lying in bed, then I know, oh, the next thing I need to do is, and then say it's brush your teeth. and that's my sort of regular routine. And then after that, you get some kind of reward. And Charles Duhigg talked about the reward we get from brushing our teeth, about like minty freshness feeling that we think this is so nice. And my breath smells good and I feel great about that. It tastes a little bit nice. Okay, then you repeat that enough times and it starts to become automatic. You don't have to think about it anymore. Every morning when I wake up, this is what I need to do, you know. So there are things that are automatic in our lives, from brewing coffee. If we're coffee drinkers, we no longer really have to think about it because we have that sort of consistency of a cue, whatever it is that triggers knowing it's time to do X. We get a reward from doing it. We've done that enough times. And so we can be deliberate about that. We can try to design our lives in ways that support habits so that we can do things like, I'll give you an example in my own life. When my son went back to Zoom preschool, I realized, okay, I need he was in Zoom preschool. When he went back to Zoom in-person school, I was at this juncture where I needed to figure out a new exercise routine. My routine for a while had been we'd go on a walk for half an hour every day when he had a break from school in the morning, from Zoom school, and that was gone because I was dropping him off. So I piggybacked, which is another strategy that can be handy in with habits. I said, okay, what's a habit I already have? What can I basically stick this on top of where there's a cue that's really consistent, that's recurring? I'll do it after that, and then I'll get a reward. And I sort of, there's different ways of rewarding yourself. I wear a Fitbit, so I find it really rewarding to get to see that spike in activity and track it for myself. Some people do it with get a chocolate bar or something along those lines. And I work out at the same time every day. And that's how I built a new routine. I did it right after toothbrushing and before jumping in the shower, because I'm already ready to go. So that was how I built that habit over and over again after a couple of weeks, and it became automatic. But I've done some research that actually points to one tricky thing about habits and about this model, which we have this idea that the more consistency and the time when you engage in a behavior, the more likely it is to go on autopilot. And so we ran this experiment with Google employees. They like to call them Googlers. And we had 2,500 people who wanted to build an exercise habit, and we randomly assigned them to two groups. One group gets rewards if they go to the gym basically at a consistent time of day. And so they pick their regular time. That's when they get the rewards if they go. So we get about 85% of them are making their gym visits for a month at the same time every day, say 7 a.m. Another group also tells us when the best time is for them to go to the gym. They also get reminded to go to the gym at that time, but we reward them for going then or at other times. As a result, about half of their workouts are at this 7 a.m. time. So we've got two groups in the end who end up going to the gym about the same frequency, but one group is going 85% of the time, always at the same time. The other group, half the time. The question is, after a month of really encouraging that behavior, giving them incentives for that, rewarding it, we let go, the program ends, they're not being rewarded anymore. Who has built a more stable and lasting habit? I feel like I should ask you, George.
I know, and I'll tell you, I know, but I got it wrong.
Did you get it wrong?
I got it wrong originally. I got it, me and everyone else. So what do you think?
And me, because we were like, this is our brilliant design. So
I would have bet a lot. I would have bet a fair amount of money on that.
80% of psychologists we surveyed were sure that the consistent routine would survive longer. And we weren't all crazy, because the folks with that consistent routine did go a bit more consistently to the gym at the very same time after the program ended, but only a little more. But if they didn't go at that time, they didn't go at all. And the other group had built I now think of it as a more elastic habit. So if they missed their regular workout time, they still found a way to go at other times at a pretty high frequency. So by creating these sort of really rigid habits, we can sometimes hurt ourselves. I think that's a really important insight about habit, is that we do want to use this loop to sort of create cues and some degree of consistency and rewarding yourself for doing it repeatedly, but that it's actually important to not be too rigid in the way you form your habits.
One thing this brings up is, obviously, we haven't talked about the pandemic. It's hard. This is the longest conversation I've had without talking about the pandemic. But I think what's interesting about the pandemic is you both have people presumably who had good habits because, they went to the gym on the way to work or whatever, who didn't persevere with those habits, obviously, because the gym wasn't open and they didn't substitute. but also people who, and we'll talk about fresh starts, but probably, had a more open calendar and were able to, establish habits. So, I'm curious about what you think, or what you'd like people coming out of the pandemic to think about in terms of, either persisting with the habits that they have that are, let's just say, be tested because now I have to go to work and I have to get in a car and all kinds of things like that, but also start new habits that they weren't able to establish successfully during the pandemic.
I'm very excited in many ways. I mean, we all are excited to be seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. So there's nothing special about me being excited about that. I'm human. I'm excited. This is maybe almost over. And hopefully, other countries will start seeing that relief that we're starting to feel soon as well. I know obviously it's farther from over in many places. But with a light at the end of the tunnel comes an opportunity, because of the fact that at moments that feel like fresh starts, when we feel like we're opening a new chapter in our lives, research that I've done with Heng-Chen Dai and Jason Reese suggests that we're more motivated to pursue our goals. Those moments that feel like a new beginning, because we can say, okay, 1 year has bookended, and that was the old me. This is the new me. It's what New Year's resolutions are driven by, right? There's also the social norm around New Year's resolutions. Everybody's asking, there's articles, but there's also this, like last year I didn't quit smoking. Last year I wasn't cooking meals for my family. Last year I wasn't exercising, but that was the old me. This is the new me. And there's also a tendency to do more reflecting and step back and think big picture about our lives. And so we expect there's going to be a lot of that happening at the end of the pandemic, at this new phase, I should say, in the pandemic, as things are starting to reopen and feel safer. And I think that's really exciting. I think hopefully lots of people will use that momentum to improve their health, to improve their education, to figure out if they're in the right job, to figure out if they're in the right relationships. There will be a lot of reflection. I would expect a lot of change. But I want to talk about one other really interesting study that makes me hopeful about this moment, and that was the study that was done. I know this is a really weird thing to connect that. It was a study that was done of a London tube strike in 2004. And a team of economists, I'm actually embarrassed that I can't think of the names right now because I've been doing a decent job of naming everyone, but it's a brilliant article. Hopefully people will Google it and find the names and give credit where credit is due. And they looked at the effect of this tube strike. It was a 2-day strike, and it closed a series of tube stations but left others open. So commuters had to find some new way to get to work if things had changed. So it's basically a forced experiment. And the paper's key finding is most people, after the 2-day closure, the question is like, what happens? Do they go back to their old to work? Most people do. 95% of people, they've had this interference with their lives, and they go back to the old way, the way that they were used to doing things as soon as the interference ends. But 5% do things differently. And what's really interesting is that the researchers were able to get data on what those 5% kind of look like, what happened with their routines and their commutes. And they found that the 5% who changed their paths were actually disproportionately located on portions of the tube where the map is distorted. So they probably had bad information about like what was the most efficient way to get to work. They assumed they'd figured it out. And this forced closure led them to experiment in a way they might not have ever wanted to or bothered to before. And they learned something useful. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about what we've just been through in the last year, setting aside obviously the grief and loss in terms of, coming out of this pandemic. Have we learned things from a period where we were forced to change the way we worked, the way we socialized? Probably 95% of what we learned is, I want to go back to the old way. But maybe 5% of the things we were forced to try, like concerts are better in person, there's no question. But maybe you like your new work, maybe you want to work from home on Fridays, maybe maybe you discovered that taking hikes with your family is actually better than going to the museum on Saturday afternoon. So what are the things we discovered? I think we should be really deliberate about thinking, what were the things we discovered that we want to keep, so we make sure that we hold on to those.
Yeah, one of the things you write about is laziness. And I mean, I think, you, both of us and lots of other of our friends have taught in Zoom and things like that. And there are lots of miserable parts of that. But I think there's a lot of serendipity in the sense that if we're going to do the same thing that we did before, it's going to be awful. And so we've tried a bunch of things, and some of those things failed, but a lot of the things are keepers. And I think that's a great inspiration, that, shaking things up and experiment. We don't experiment partly because I think of all the things that you've said. One thing I want to turn back to is your book and your personal journey through the book. You wrote the book mostly during the pandemic, is that right? And a lot of it.
A lot of it. The introduction and a lot of revisions.
Okay. Well, whether or not you wrote it through one thing that almost all of my friends describe writing a book as a slog, and it takes many longer. So I'm curious about what you did to keep your motivation. I mean, you think it sounds exactly like the volunteer study. 200 hours of volunteering sounds impossible. 4 hours a week sounds doable. So what were the things that you did to keep yourself writing 10 pages a day, or I don't know what you did, but I'm curious. I'm taking.
I used almost all of the tricks in the book, literally in the book I was writing.
There's going to be a companion book, which is basically the applied version to your book.
Tricks that were used to write the book about the tricks. Anyway, it feels a little bit circular.
Yeah, the play within a play.
Yes, exactly. Actually, the first trick was getting started, and actually that even maps onto something in the book, which was that the day we bought our first house was the day I said, okay, I'm ready. This is a fresh start. I'm moving into my first home. I'm ready to write a book. I've been thinking about doing it for ages, and that sort of kicked me into gear to actually get it. It's a long process before you sell a book and find a publisher and all those things, but that's the day it started, when I sent my first set of emails to people about how do I do this. Okay, so a fresh start got me going. And then in terms of keeping, actually writing, I broke it down for sure. So I blocked Fridays as writing days. And then I took a sabbatical so that I would actually, about halfway through the book, the sabbatical began. And then I blocked 3 days a week instead of 1 day a week. And those were, no meetings, nothing but writing, full days. But even 1 day a week was enough. It took me about 2 years to write the whole thing, even with all that. But that was an okay pace. I was happy with it. And I hired a research assistant to help with the book. That was a commitment device because I had this person essentially, it was more of a psychological, but she was holding me accountable. There was this person who was doing things, sending them to me, needing things back. I'm paying her. She's sitting there doing nothing if I'm not actually getting her a next chapter, next project, a next thing to react to. So that was really helpful to have some accountability to another person in the process too, because I'm not very good at doing things without a degree of accountability. And, of course, broke down each chapter. There were goals each week. So lots and lots of the tactics in the book. I'm trying to think of what else I used. I think of the consistency as part of the habit of writing that I got into as well. So there were definitely habits.
Okay, I want to turn to a kind of final set of conversations. Actually, you spend a lot of time as a researcher changing other people's behavior. So you talked about changing your own behavior. I'm wondering what do you think is of the psychology and the kind of things that you've talked about in terms of changing your own behavior is the same or different when you think about changing other people's behavior?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I actually think a huge number of things are the same. I think the trickiest, and I tried to write about this in the book, is some of the social forces are easier to muster that change behavior. We haven't really talked about the power of social forces, but it's easier to think about how to use some social tools to change behavior in others than in yourself. So I think if you get really sophisticated, there are ways to do it. So peer pressure is, one of the big influencers of behavior. Robert Cialdini's sort of the great researcher who has proven the power of social influence. If you see everyone else is doing it, you're much more likely to do it yourself. It's a little bit of a harder tool to use to help yourself. I think that's true of a lot of social influences. It's easier to imagine conveying information to someone about, hey, the crowd's doing this, or displaying how many, making it visible to someone how often this is the popular choice, than it is to think about, well, how do I harness that to improve my own outcomes if I know I'm influenced by conformity. So that was actually one of the challenges in writing the book, was thinking I want to use some of the great insights. We know it's so powerful for behavior change to be influenced by others. How can we think about turning that into a tool of sort of, I'll call it self-help. Richard Thaler coined the term snudging the other day. It's self-nudging. Right. And I kind of hope that doesn't stick. I'm glad he didn't suggest that I name the book that.
Katy, can you repeat that term? Just kidding.
It's funny. I don't know if it's
funny.
Probably not catchy, but I think
it's a good t-shirt. We'll buy you a t-shirt with that.
I think that's different. I mean, the other thing that's nice about snudging is some of the ethical challenges that we have to worry about when it comes to changing the behavior of other people go away, which I really like, right? So as soon as you're trying to give people guidance on how to overcome their own obstacles and their own barriers, you don't have to worry anymore that you might be behaving in a way that's coercive. So I think that's another really important thing. And you don't have to worry about backlash relatedly, right? So there's sometimes when we try to influence other people and we feel manipulated. I wrote a little bit about gamification, which can backfire. It's trying to make it fun for other people. But if you feel manipulated, it seems like gamification is often not very effective and doesn't achieve its goals. And the same can be true of extreme attempts at social influence. But again, that goes away for snudging. So I do think I think there's some differences, but I think there's a lot of commonalities, and almost all of the insights actually in the book are based on large studies where an organization is testing tactics to change individual behavior, and then that insight can be turned into a tool you can use to help yourself.
So one thing that is maybe, obviously pertinent today is vaccination. You've studied vaccination quite a bit. We'll put the sort of politics of COVID aside, because I think they're a little, unless you want to talk about them, but you've done a bunch of vaccination studies, seasonal flu kinds of things. And I think the studies on how you increase take up of vaccination is kind of a remarkable thing. And I think it's a great lesson for how we can use psychology to, improve outcomes. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would love that. So one of the things that's been most exciting to do in my career has been, along with Angela Duckworth, who's a psychologist at Penn and a close friend and collaborator, I founded this initiative called the Behavior Change for Good Initiative. And the goal of the initiative is really to accelerate the science of behavior change. And we have a team, an interdisciplinary team that's constantly growing. I think we're at 150 and we'll keep getting bigger. And the number of Booth faculty actually might be more than the number of Penn faculty who are on the team, which we have to keep a handle on, or the deans will give us a hard time. But it's the work of the center has ended up focusing around a new kind of science that we call the science of doing mega studies. It's not that new in that, big science has been around forever, but we're trying to create big team science in a different kind of way to advance knowledge around behavior change. So a mega study, and I'll explain why I'm talking about this in terms of vaccines in just a second. So a mega study involves, instead of testing one hypothesis at a time, we pool lots of hypotheses from lots of different researchers around the same question, and we run a random assignment trial that tests all of those hypotheses at once on the same outcome variable. So we've been sort of pioneering this a new approach, and roughly this time last year, we realized that a really important problem was going to be coming around the bend, which was making sure that we compelled as many people as possible to take the COVID-19 vaccine should one be deemed safe and effective. So we said, let's get to work on that right away and we'll run a mega study. We started working on it last summer. We partnered with Walmart pharmacies and with 2 regional health systems, Penn Medicine and Geisinger Health, on 2 separate mega studies, one to try to nudge pharmacy customers to get vaccines, and the other to try to nudge patients who had a healthy visit with their doctor to accept a vaccine when it was offered to them at that visit. And we did this actually around flu season of last fall because we wanted to know what worked in time for this moment that we're in right now. And we felt like we need to sort of get the work done then. We tested messages developed. I think we had something like 75 different message or hypotheses submitted by teams of scientists around the world around things that they felt would move the needle, pun intended, on both flu vaccines, but everyone knew the end goal was to nudge COVID-19 vaccinations. So the messages weren't about things like, here's how safe this is and how well it's been tested. They were behavioral science messages that were portable, things like everybody else in your community is getting one, or do it to protect other people, or dedicate this to a loved one, or here's a joke that might help you remember to get your vaccine. Yeah. Those are the kinds of things tested. And we ran these mega trials. There was something like 700,000 Walmart pharmacy customers who got different text messages. And then we looked and saw, did they get a vaccine? And 50,000 patients who were going in to see doctors for doctor's appointments, did they get a vaccine? And what we found actually at all 3 sites was shockingly consistent, even though we tested very different ideas in the very different settings. Mm-hmm. Every single place we ran the test, the top performing intervention was basically a set of 2 text messages that said, you have an appointment coming up and you should get this vaccine and it's reserved for you. Or in Walmart, we said it's waiting for you. So the language of reserved for you or waiting for you rose to the top in every setting. I think what's going on there, and actually I'm curious how you would interpret it, but I think what's going on there is it's conveying this is the presumed default that, we think you want it. That's why we've set it aside for you. Who wouldn't want it? And also, there's a little bit of endowment effect, perhaps. You think, oh, it's mine. I don't want to give that up. I really don't like giving things up that are mine. You've already allocated it to me. So we suspect that that's the psychology, but the way the study is designed, we can't tease out other potential explanations.
No, it's great. I love this idea that basically, it's hard to know ahead of time what things are going to succeed. I think we're probably right more often than we're wrong, but we're just because I think behavioral science in the world, because it interacts with a lot of things, is really hard. So I think doing these studies and, getting a few more percent or, sometimes 5% more people to do these things is just a great thing. So I'm going to ask you one last question and then we'll wrap up. A lot of people are thinking about not changing other people's behavior in the sense of large interventions like you did with Walmart, but thinking about influencing people in organizations and friends and families to do other kinds of things. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about what people could do to help others in their organization be better.
I love that question. There's lots of different insights that science has to offer, many in the book that can be used to help other people perform better. But let me pick out my favorite one that we haven't talked about yet. And I get to leave you with one of my favorite studies. And this is research on the power of, instead of following your instinct, which is to give other people advice when they're struggling, actually flipping the script. And this is work that was led by Lauren Eskris-Winkler. And actually, Ayelet Fishbach was involved in one of the papers on this topic. She's a superstar. And Lauren has shown that our instinct is give other people advice, but sometimes it's actually much more effective when we invite them instead to coach someone else on how to achieve the very same goal. And the logic is, when you ask someone who's struggling, say a student who isn't getting great grades, if they would give some advice on good study habits to a younger peer, it puts them on a pedestal. So it boosts their self-confidence. Oh, you think I'm a role model? Wow, that's amazing. Maybe I'm not so bad at school. It also makes them introspect about things that will work, and they think about the things that have been their own obstacles and that might help them. So they do some deeper thinking than they might do if they were just trying to fix their own problems, because they feel this accountability to help someone else. And then once they've given that advice, which may have dredged up new insights to someone else, it's going to feel hypocritical if they don't follow through on it themselves. So Lauren has a bunch of studies. I got to be a part of one of them showing that this can be really effective. And the study I love most that I worked on with her, we randomly assigned high school students, thousands of them, to either spend 10 minutes giving other younger peers advice on how to do better in school, or to a control condition. And the students randomly assigned to give coaching tips for 10 minutes in an online forum to their younger peers about how to study more effectively got slightly higher grades. And significantly, though it's a small effect. I don't want anyone to think we're going to turn C students into valedictorians, but a 1 point improvement in their GPA from 50 to 51 or something, or 75 to 76, robustly in the class they most hope to improve in, and in math. So yeah. I think we can all ask other people to do more mentoring and coaching when we want to improve their own outcomes, is my answer to your original question.
Yeah, it's so counterintuitive, because I think that I should be changing your behavior by telling you what you do badly. And, Katy, you should do this and that and whatever. And to sort of have the bad performers talk about what they're doing and advice for others is really counterintuitive. I love that idea. So I think we have just a few more minutes. I'm gonna end with the question that you end your book with, and I think it's a question that a lot of people have, which is we get people to make change. You got a lot of great ideas for getting people to make change. How do you make that change lasting, persistent, forever? Nothing's forever, but as long as we can make it.
Yeah, I will say that when I started doing work in this area, I was looking for a silver bullet, like an intervention that we deploy for a month and it would change people for the rest of their lives. And it's not that I've completely given up on the fact that we can do things that change people, but I will say when we deploy an intervention and take it away, maybe we see 25 to 30% of the change we create endure. So it's not like there's no benefit and no durability, but increasingly, I have adopted the mindset or the way of thinking about it of my colleague, Kevin Volk, who put it really well when I came to him frustrated with this data. And Kevin, I relay this story in the book. He said, Katy, why do we think of change as something that should be one and done? Like if we diagnose someone with diabetes, which is a chronic condition, we don't give them insulin for a month, take them off of it, and expect them to be cured. We recognize this is a chronic condition. It requires chronic treatment. And so I think that way of thinking about change is right. None of the barriers to change, the impulsivity, the tendency to procrastinate, the challenges with self-confidence, the tendency to take the path of least resistance, the fact that we're forgetful, those things don't go away if you go through a habit program or learn even any of the techniques that are in this book. They're with us, they're chronic. And then the solution really is when we find these tricks, the things that help us make it fun to do our workout, the advice club we form so that we're surrounded by people who are role models and being asked by them for advice that will eventually help us with our careers as well. Those things we can keep doing. They don't need to be a one-time. And so whenever we can keep building these structures, change our environments in ways that support change our social networks, and change our approach, it should be something we consider we're doing for a lifetime, not for a short period until we've, flipped the switch and magically we've got it and it's on autopilot.
Yeah, and presumably the more we practice this, the more just ideas come to mind. We get better at diagnosing and thinking, and we find the tricks that work for us, and so on. So I think that's a great way of thinking about it. So thank you very much, Katy. It's a great pleasure to spend an hour with you. I can't wait to see you in person. thanks to everybody for attending. That's the end of our event. So we'll be announcing next year's speakers for this Think Better series soon. And one of them will be my colleague and one of Katie's heroes, the 2017 Nobel laureate in economics, Richard Thaler. So thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure. Great luck with your book. It's a wonderful thing. I hope as many people read the book as possible.
Thank you so much, George. This was really, really fun.